The moment that sparked whispers wasn't a polished interview or a planned confession, but an offhand remark that slipped through the cracks. It was said quietly, framed as reflection rather than revelation, yet it carried a weight that couldn't be ignored. Those who heard it described a pause afterward, the kind that signals someone realizing they've gone too far. What made it unsettling was not what was said explicitly, but what it implied about a line he came dangerously close to crossing. For Jamie Dornan, the idea of admitting vulnerability has always been carefully managed. Publicly, he projected control, humor, and a deep respect for his private life. Yet behind that image, the demands of intense roles blurred emotional boundaries in ways he later acknowledged were difficult to navigate. Acting wasn't just performance anymore, it was immersion, and immersion has consequences when it doesn't end at cut. The chemistry with Dakota Johnson became a central test of that discipline. On screen, it was celebrated, dissected, and rewarded with global attention. Off-screen, however, it created an emotional momentum that neither scripts nor schedules could fully contain. What began as professional trust slowly took on a gravity that required constant self-awareness to resist. Those close to the production noticed subtle changes long before fans did. Jamie appeared more introspective during certain periods, quieter between takes, less present in casual conversations. It wasn't dramatic or obvious, just a shift in energy that suggested internal conflict. When asked later about those years, he hinted at moments where the separation between character and self felt uncomfortably thin. Marriage adds another layer of complexity to that experience. Being deeply committed at home while portraying intense intimacy on set demands emotional boundaries that aren't always intuitive. Jamie has spoken about how difficult it was to leave certain characters behind, especially when the emotional connection felt real in the moment. That honesty, while admirable, opened the door to uncomfortable questions. According to those familiar with the situation, the strain wasn't caused by a single event but by accumulation. Long days of filming, repeated scenes of vulnerability, and the pressure to deliver authenticity created a perfect storm. Each moment alone might have been manageable, but together they tested the limits of restraint. It wasn't scandal in the traditional sense, but a slow erosion of emotional distance. What made it particularly dangerous was how invisible it all was to the outside world. There were no secret meetings, no reckless behavior, nothing that tabloids could latch onto. Instead, the risk lived entirely in the realm of feeling, in thoughts that lingered too long and connections that felt too strong. That kind of threat is harder to confront because it leaves no evidence behind. Jamie later alluded to a realization that arrived before anything irreversible happened. It was the awareness that even unspoken emotions could damage something real if left unchecked. That recognition forced a reckoning, one that required stepping back emotionally even while remaining professionally present. For someone known for fully committing to his roles, that restraint did not come easily. During this period, observers noted a shift in how he discussed his work publicly. Praise became more measured, anecdotes less personal, language carefully neutral. It wasn't coldness, but caution, a deliberate effort to close doors that had been left slightly open. In doing so, he protected more than his image, he protected a foundation he wasn't willing to lose. What fans interpreted years later as distance or awkwardness was, in reality, the aftermath of a difficult internal decision. The chemistry hadn't vanished, it had been contained. That containment came with a cost, including the emotional labor of suppressing feelings that were never meant to surface publicly. It's a side of acting rarely discussed, because it challenges the romantic idea of artistic freedom. The near collapse of a marriage doesn't always announce itself with betrayal. Sometimes it appears as temptation recognized just in time, as a moment where the wrong choice is avoided rather than made. Jamie's experience sits uncomfortably in that space, between confession and restraint. It's not a story of what happened, but of what almost did, and how close that line truly was. By choosing to acknowledge the struggle rather than deny it outright, he offered a rare glimpse into the emotional risks behind the craft. The admission wasn't meant to shock, yet it resonated because of its honesty. It suggested that the most dangerous moments are often the quietest ones. And that sometimes, saving what matters most requires admitting how fragile it once was. What followed that internal reckoning was not relief, but a period of careful reconstruction. Once Jamie Dornan recognized how close things had come to causing real damage, the priority shifted from emotion to preservation. This wasn't a dramatic ultimatum or a public turning point, but a quiet decision repeated daily. Choosing stability over impulse often looks uneventful from the outside, yet it demands constant discipline. Those close to him noticed how deliberate his behavior became afterward. Workdays ended more quickly, social interactions narrowed, and personal space was guarded with unusual precision. It wasn't distance born of indifference, but of intention. The goal was no longer to explore emotional depth freely, but to limit it where it posed risk. The dynamic with Dakota Johnson changed in ways subtle enough to escape casual notice. Conversations became shorter, humor more neutral, and physical proximity carefully moderated. To the public, it looked like professionalism evolving over time. To those aware of the context, it was containment, a conscious effort to redirect energy back into safe boundaries. That shift carried its own emotional cost. Suppressing feelings doesn't erase them, it repackages them into restraint. There were moments, insiders say, when the tension was palpable, not because something was happening, but because something was being actively prevented. That kind of silence can be louder than any scandal. At home, the consequences of that near miss reportedly prompted deeper conversations. When emotional strain enters a marriage, it doesn't require proof to be felt. The weight of what almost happened can linger just as heavily as an actual betrayal. Repair, in this sense, wasn't about forgiveness, but reassurance and recommitment. Jamie's later reflections suggested an awareness that honesty alone doesn't absolve responsibility. A confession can explain, but it doesn't undo. By acknowledging the risk without dramatizing it, he framed the experience as a lesson rather than an excuse. That framing mattered, especially in an industry where oversharing is often mistaken for accountability. Professionally, the aftermath influenced how future roles were approached. Intimacy was no longer something entered without boundaries, and emotional preparation came with exit strategies. The craft remained important, but it no longer justified personal imbalance. In a subtle way, the experience reshaped how he defined commitment, both on and off screen. Public reaction to the confession was predictably divided. Some viewed it as refreshingly honest, a rare admission of emotional complexity in a world of polished denials. Others questioned why such a revelation was necessary at all. That tension mirrored the story itself, caught between transparency and discretion. What made the admission linger was its specificity without detail. He didn't name moments, actions, or outcomes, leaving space for interpretation. That ambiguity invited imagination, but also respect. It suggested boundaries still mattered, even when discussing their fragility. Over time, the narrative settled into something quieter than scandal. It became a cautionary tale about proximity, intensity, and the unintended consequences of emotional immersion. Not a story of infidelity, but of temptation acknowledged and resisted. In a culture that thrives on extremes, that middle ground felt unsettlingly real. The marriage endured, but not unchanged. Experiences like this don't vanish once avoided, they integrate into memory and perspective. What survived did so because of choice, not luck. That distinction is crucial, even if it lacks dramatic payoff. Hollywood often celebrates passion without examining its fallout. This story did the opposite, exposing how easily devotion to craft can blur into personal risk. It reminded audiences that restraint is rarely accidental, and fidelity isn't only measured by actions taken, but by those consciously avoided. In the end, the confession didn't rewrite the past, but it reframed it. It acknowledged vulnerability without glorifying it, and responsibility without spectacle. The real takeaway wasn't about who inspired the risk, but about the decision to step back before everything unraveled. Sometimes the most meaningful victories are the ones no one ever sees.